In the autumn of 1884, the German mathematician Georg Cantor suffered a collapse so severe that his colleagues at the University of Halle quietly arranged for him to be admitted to a nervous clinic, the first of several hospitalizations that would punctuate the rest of his life. He was 40 years old, the creator of a theory of infinite sets that some of the most powerful men in European mathematics considered not merely wrong but dangerous, and he had spent a decade fighting for its acceptance against a former mentor who called him a corrupter of youth. The question this story keeps returning to is not whether genius and madness are mystically linked, as popular legend likes to claim, but something more precise and more historically answerable. What specific pressures, rivalries, and institutional cruelties pushed a series of brilliant, disciplined, hard-working scientists past the edge of what their minds could carry? Cantor's crisis did not come from nowhere. It came from a mathematician named Leopold Kronecker, a powerful professor at the University of Berlin who believed that infinity itself was a theological trap and that Cantor's transfinite numbers were, in his words, a disease infecting mathematics. Kronecker used his influence on editorial boards and hiring committees to block Cantor's papers and to keep him from ever obtaining a prestigious chair in Berlin, exiling him instead to the provincial University of Halle for his entire career. Cantor was not a fragile man by temperament. His early correspondence shows confidence bordering on missionary certainty, and he once wrote to a colleague that he was merely reporting what he found, since in mathematics the actual infinite exists, whether Kronecker approves or not. But being professionally starved for 20 years by a man who controlled the institutions that could have validated him took a measurable toll, one his own letters describe in language of persecution and despair. He was not without allies, and this matters because the myth of the isolated tortured genius erases the people who kept him working. Richard Dedekind, a fellow mathematician and lifelong friend, exchanged hundreds of letters with Cantor, testing and refining the logic of set theory line by line. The Swedish mathematician Gustav Mittag-Leffler founded the journal Acta Mathematica partly as a venue where Cantor's papers could appear without Kronecker's veto, and for years the two men corresponded warmly about publishing strategy. Yet even Mittag-Leffler eventually urged Cantor to slow down and stop pushing his most radical claims, advice Cantor received as a fresh betrayal from someone he had trusted, and he broke off correspondence with him for years. The pattern recurs across this story: brilliant men sustained by real collaborators, and then wounded precisely by the withdrawal or hesitation of those same collaborators. By 1899, after the death of his youngest son, Cantor suffered a second, more severe breakdown, and he was hospitalized again, this time for months. He continued mathematical work in the years between episodes, and he also drifted toward increasingly elaborate theological arguments about infinity and increasingly obsessive attempts to prove that Francis Bacon had secretly written Shakespeare's plays, a hobby that consumed enormous energy and that colleagues viewed with a mixture of affection and alarm. He died in 1918 in the same asylum in Halle, where he had been treated years earlier, in the final months of the First World War, having lived long enough to see younger mathematicians like David Hilbert defend his work as one of the supreme achievements of the human intellect. Hilbert's famous line, that no one should be permitted to expel mathematicians from the paradise Cantor had created, was delivered in 1925, 7 years after Cantor's death, and roughly 40 years after Kronecker first tried to bury the theory that made it necessary. 2 centuries earlier, in the spring of 1693, Isaac Newton underwent a breakdown of his own, one visible in a strange and unsettling set of letters he wrote to 2 of the most important men in his life. To John Locke, the philosopher who had helped Newton navigate London's political world, Newton wrote, accusing him of trying to embroil him with women and admitting he wished Locke dead. To Samuel Pepys, the naval administrator and diarist who had helped Newton secure standing at court, he wrote that he could no longer bear to see him or any of his friends, and that he was so disturbed he could neither eat nor sleep properly. Newton later apologized to both men, attributing the episode to sleeplessness, and both accepted the apology and remained in contact with him, which tells us something important. Whatever happened to Newton in 1693, the people closest to him treated it as an eruption to be weathered, not a permanent verdict on his character. Historians have long speculated about causes, and mercury poisoning is the most durable of these theories, since Newton spent decades conducting private alchemical experiments in a laboratory behind Trinity College, heating and distilling mercury and other metals in pursuit of the philosopher's stone, and a 1979 chemical analysis of a lock of his hair, reportedly attributed to Newton, did find elevated mercury levels. But this diagnosis remains disputed among historians, partly because the hair sample's provenance is uncertain, and partly because mercury exposure alone cannot explain the specific timing or shape of the 1693 crisis, which arrived shortly after the failure to secure a hoped-for court appointment and amid the grinding isolation of his alchemical work. What is not disputed is the isolation itself. Newton's alchemical notebooks, tens of thousands of words of coded recipes, and biblical numerology were kept almost entirely secret from his scientific peers during his lifetime, published only centuries later, because Newton understood that alchemy carried the whiff of fraud and heresy in a Cambridge still governed by Anglican orthodoxy. He lived in effect two separate scientific lives, one public and mathematically triumphant, one private, chemical and secretive, and the strain of maintaining that separation for 30 years is itself a documented feature of his temperament, not a modern retrospective diagnosis imposed on him. Newton's public life supplies its own evidence of a mind that ran hot with grievance, long before and long after 1693. His feud with Robert Hooke over credit for ideas about light and gravity was bitter enough that Newton, upon becoming president of the Royal Society in 1703 after Hooke's death, is widely reported to have overseen the removal or neglect of the only known portrait of his rival, though the precise circumstances of that portrait's disappearance remain a matter of historical debate rather than settled fact. His later dispute with the German mathematician Gottfried Leibniz, over who first invented calculus, escalated into one of the ugliest priority battles in the history of science, with Newton anonymously authoring a Royal Society report that declared himself the true inventor while pretending the judgment came from a neutral committee. He kept fighting this battle into his 80s, revising editions of his own works to bolster his priority claim years after Leibniz had died and could no longer respond. None of this fits comfortably into a story of a single mad episode in 1693. It fits a longer pattern of a man for whom being first, being right, and being publicly vindicated mattered as much as the science itself, a temperament that both built the Principia and made him nearly impossible to work alongside. If Newton's crisis was private and largely hidden from the public, the collapse of the Hungarian physician Ignaz Semmelweis played out in full view, and it offers one of the starkest documented cases of a scientist destroyed by the very institution he was trying to save lives within. In the 1840s, working in the maternity wards of Vienna General Hospital, Semmelweis noticed a horrifying pattern. Mothers giving birth in the wards staffed by doctors and medical students were dying of childbed fever at dramatically higher rates than those in the wards staffed by midwives. He eventually connected this to a specific practice, doctors performing autopsies on fever victims and then, without washing their hands, moving directly to deliver babies, carrying invisible cadaverous matter from the dissection room to the birthing bed. When he instituted a strict hand-washing protocol with chlorinated lime solution in 1847, mortality in his ward dropped from roughly 18% to around 2% within months, a result recorded in the hospital's own statistics. This should have been a triumph, and instead it became the central catastrophe of his career, because Semmelweis could offer no accepted mechanism for why washing hands worked. Since the germ theory of disease was still decades away from general acceptance, and many senior physicians found it professionally and personally offensive to be told that their own unwashed hands were killing patients. His superior at the hospital, Johann Klein, opposed him and eventually declined to renew his position. Semmelweis, rather than publishing a careful, persuasive account of his evidence early on, delayed writing up his findings for years, and when he finally did publish a lengthy book in 1861, filled it with increasingly intemperate attacks on the doctors who doubted him. His later letters to prominent obstetricians grew openly accusatory, at one point calling a colleague a murderer for refusing to adopt hand-washing, language that alienated potential allies rather than persuading them. Some historians see in this deterioration the toll of years of professional rejection compounding on itself. Others caution that we cannot retroactively diagnose the man from a distance of over a century, and that his rhetorical excess also reflected a genuine, well-founded fury at colleagues whose stubbornness was, in cold statistical fact, costing lives. In July 1865, Semmelweis was committed to an asylum in Vienna, reportedly lured there under false pretenses by colleagues and family members who believed he had become dangerously unstable. Accounts describe him being restrained and beaten by asylum guards, and he died just 2 weeks later from a gangrenous wound, quite possibly from the very kind of infection his own discovery had sought to prevent, a detail so bitterly fitting that some historians treat it with caution as possibly embellished by later retelling, though hospital records do confirm the wound and the rapid death. It would take the rise of germ theory through Louis Pasteur and the antiseptic surgical techniques of Joseph Lister in the following decade for the medical establishment to recognize, mostly after Semmelweis was already dead, that he had been right, and that his major documented failure was not scientific but rhetorical and institutional. He had the evidence years before he had a persuasive mechanism, and he ran out of patience, allies, and credibility before science caught up to explain what he already knew. The Austrian physicist Ludwig Boltzmann's story shares a similar shape, a scientist proven right only after his death, but it unfolds inside a different kind of institutional war, one fought not over hygiene, but over the reality of atoms. Through the final decades of the 19th century, Boltzmann developed statistical explanations for heat and gas behavior that depended on treating matter as composed of vast numbers of discrete, invisibly small particles in constant motion. An idea that seems obvious to us now, but that a powerful faction of European scientists, led by the chemist Wilhelm Ostwald and the physicist-philosopher Ernst Mach, considered scientifically unjustified. Mach and Ostwald championed a rival view called energetics, arguing that physics should describe only directly measurable quantities like energy and should not speculate about unseen atomic machinery. At a famous meeting of German scientists in Lübeck in 1895, Boltzmann publicly debated Ostwald over the reality of atoms, a confrontation contemporaries described as intense, with the young Arnold Sommerfeld present in the audience, later recalling that the argument between the two men resembled a bullfight, with Boltzmann's superior command of mathematics eventually winning the room, even as the philosophical objection lingered unresolved for another decade. Boltzmann was, by multiple accounts, a man of restless intellect and genuine warmth toward students. He moved between professorships in Graz, Munich, Leipzig, and Vienna, partly out of intellectual curiosity, and partly, his own letters suggest, out of a recurring dissatisfaction and low mood that predated any of his scientific controversies. He suffered what he described as attacks of depression for years, and he attempted suicide at least once in 1900 while in Leipzig, reportedly after a period of exhaustion and illness, before recovering enough to return to teaching and to accept a position back in Vienna. His students, including the young Paul Ehrenfest, who would go on to become an important physicist in his own right, remembered him as a captivating, humane lecturer who wept when reciting poetry in class and who took his students' scientific doubts seriously even when he disagreed with them, a warmth that sits uneasily against the image of a man privately worn down by both illness and controversy. In September 1906, while on a holiday with his family at Duino, near Trieste, Boltzmann hanged himself in his hotel room while his wife and daughter were out swimming. He was 62. The precise motive remains genuinely disputed among historians. Contemporaries and later biographers have pointed to failing eyesight, chronic ill health, recurring depressive episodes, and the long, exhausting battle over atomism as intertwined and inseparable causes, and no single letter or diary entry offers a clean explanation. What compounds the tragedy factually and not merely poetically is timing. In that same year, the French physicist June Perrin was completing experimental work building on Albert Einstein's 1905 paper on Brownian motion, work that would, within a few years, provide direct, broadly persuasive physical evidence for the real existence of atoms, essentially vindicating the position Boltzmann had spent his career defending against Mach and Ostwald. He died just before the argument he had fought hardest for was settled decisively in his favor, a fact his students and later physicists have returned to with a particular kind of professional grief that has nothing to do with sentimentality and everything to do with recognizing how close vindication came. Laid side by side, these 4 case studies resist a single tidy explanation, and a careful historian has to resist the temptation to flatten them into one convenient moral. Cantor's crises were entangled with grief over his son's death and with decades of deliberate professional exclusion engineered by a rival with institutional power. Newton's episode was entangled with secret alchemical labor, possible chemical exposure that remains scientifically uncertain, and a temperament already prone to grievance and vindication seeking throughout his life, before and after 1693. Semmelweis was undone by the specific historically contingent problem of having correct evidence decades before science possessed a theory that could explain it, compounded by his own worsening rhetoric and the intransigence of colleagues protecting professional pride. Boltzmann's death sits at the intersection of a long scientific war over the nature of matter and a personal history of depressive illness that predated and outlasted that war and cannot be reduced to either alone. What does connect them is not some romantic curse attached to genius, but a set of concrete, documentable institutional realities. 19th and early modern science offered almost no formal mechanisms for resolving deep theoretical disputes quickly. A challenger to orthodoxy could spend an entire career, and sometimes an entire life, waiting for a decisive experiment, a shift in fashion, or the death of an entrenched opponent before being heard fairly. Academic institutions concentrated enormous personal power in individual gatekeepers like Kronecker or Klein, men who could end careers not through argument but through control of journals, professorships, and hospital wards. And the scientists who suffered most visibly were, almost without exception, the ones asking their colleagues to abandon comfortable, intuitive, or professionally convenient assumptions, that infinity is a single well-behaved concept, that a gentleman physician's hands could be lethal, that solid matter is secretly made of countless invisible moving parts. Asking an entire discipline to change its mind is rarely rewarded promptly, and the psychological cost of that delay fell on real, specific people who had families, students, and friends watching them absorb it. It is also worth resisting the seductive shortcut of assuming every eccentric or difficult scientist in this period was quietly disintegrating. Most were not, and many of the era's most productive researchers, from Dmitry Mendeleev to Marie Curie, endured comparable institutional hostility, sexism, and professional rejection without anything resembling the breakdowns described here, which is itself evidence that individual constitution, family circumstance, physical health, and plain chance mattered as much as external pressure. The stories that survive most vividly in popular memory tend to be the dramatic ones, and later biographers and popular science writers have sometimes exaggerated or tidied these episodes into cleaner morality tales than the archival record actually supports, turning Newton's 1693 letters into full-blown insanity, or Boltzmann's suicide into a simple parable about a man who died for atoms, when the honest documentary record is messier, more contingent, and more human than either version allows. What remains true, and what the letters, hospital records, lecture notes, and testimony of students and friends consistently show, is that scientific knowledge in these cases did not arrive gently. It arrived through people who were mocked in print, blocked from professorships, hospitalized, and in 2 of these 4 cases, dead before their vindication was complete, while the institutions around them were often slow, sometimes cruel, and occasionally, through individuals like Dedekind, Mittelgleffler, and Ehrenfest, quietly loyal in ways that kept the work alive even when the world outside refused to listen. The infinite sets, the invisible atoms, the unwashed hands carrying invisible death from one bed to the next, all of it turned out to be real. All of it eventually became foundational to how we understand mathematics, physics, and medicine, and all of it was paid for, in part, by minds that were asked to carry more certainty than the world around them was willing to grant for far longer than any person should reasonably have to wait.